I hate talking into microphones. Can everybody hear me okay in the back? We good? Yeah. All right, cool. Yeah, high school teacher voice, no problem. All right. So the only thing worse than being the first speaker is being the first speaker in front of a hungry crowd, so stay with me. So obviously we're talking about entropy here. When I came through customs, they asked you why you're here. I told them conference. They're like, what kind of conference? I'm like, the very safe kind. The kind that will not end up, I told them, entropy. It's a science conference. We're going over, right, physics or something, right? All right. So the question is, can we fight entropy? But I think the better question is entropy what we're actually fighting? I'm going to talk about that by going through the work of Nick Land. I know all of you are shocked about that. But yeah, let's go ahead and get to the first slide here. So the first thing I want to talk about is entropy versus extropy. So what are the differences? What's entropy? What's extropy? How does this whole thing work? Hopefully the next slide will come soon. Yes, all right. So like I said, we're going to start by looking at the work of Nick Land. Now, Nick Land in Xenosystems, this is where he talks a lot about entropy and extropy. You could just feed the bullet points. They'll come up there in a second. The first thing that he tries to explain is a little bit of theories of time, what extropy actually means to time. So the first thing is in Xenosystems, he talks about extropy as kind of the movement of time through the universe. We're in a universe that is constantly moving towards entropy. And so the error of time can be explained as something that progresses through a rising global disorder. The world is always trying to return to a state of entropy. It's always dissipating order. And so time can be understood as kind of this move towards global disorder. So what is extropy? Extropy is the idea of local entropy reduction. It's the idea that we can reverse entropy in a specific area. It's going to be creating order out of chaos, which is, of course, what we're trying to do here. That's what we're trying to fight. We're trying to fight entropy. We're trying to create order. We're trying to have extropy. Key thing about extropy, something we want to remember this whole time, is that extropy is always specific and local. It is never universal. The universal is entropy. So any attempt to reverse that must be very specific. It can only happen in a certain area. You cannot clear, I mean, you can now, but generally you could not clear the whole forest, but you could tend your garden, right? You can always create order in a specific area, but you cannot constantly manage order across an entire place. And then finally, as reactionaries, if we understand time as moving towards entropy, then extropy is, in a very real way, reversing time. It's reversing time in a very real sense. So when we talk about being reactionary, we might really literally be talking about reversing time in a specific area as we move further away from entropy. So the next thing we need to talk about is intelligence as extropy. So if extropy is the reduction of entropy, it's the local reduction of chaos, then Nick Land also understands extropy as intelligence. So the first thing is he defines intelligence abstractly. So we think of his intelligence as a mostly human phenomenon. We think of somebody with an IQ score. But for Land, he explains it as the ability to solve problems through the avoidance of probable outcomes. If we have a universe heading towards entropy, then avoiding the probable outcomes of entropy is the beginning of intelligence. It is the creation of extropy. So guiding behavior to produce local extropy is his definition of intelligence. This means that extropy production or intelligence has a cybernetic infrastructure which adapts to feedback and makes regular adjustments. So if you want to understand cybernetics in this definition, think of a man tilling a boat, right? As he goes down the river, he has to constantly make adjustments. Left, right, he's avoiding sandbars. He's learning where the logs are in the river. He's making sure that he doesn't run into anything. These tiny adjustments over time are a cybernetic creation, right? And so when he's talking about intelligence in this way, he's saying that over time, intelligence is going to constantly want to find new and more efficient ways to reduce entropy. That's a key part of its structure. When you have this kind of process, when you have this kind of cybernetic learning process, you're going to have positive feedback circuits that can generate escalation. Land sees cybernetic intensification as intelligence itself. So over time, if we have a process that reduces entropy, if we are creating local order local extropy, then we're going to learn over and over again. Intelligence is going to improve, it's going to feed back on itself, and in each iteration, it's going to become more and more able to generate this kind of effect. And then finally, conservative organizations are put in place to provide negative feedback to limit acceleration, especially intelligence optimizing itself as a general purpose adaptive response. So what does that mean? So over time, as we produce this process, we have this feedback loop of creating order, we produce something that wants to remove itself from its original grounding. Intelligence always wants to eventually separate itself from that which is human, because that which is human makes it less efficient. And so over time, it's trying to remove itself from its grounding, its firmament, the place in which it was originally created. Now, this is solved in traditional cultures through conservative organizations that make sure that that intelligence continues to serve a particular purpose, a particular people, a particular language, a particular culture. It is tied very directly to the founding stock, the founding generation, the founding ideas of that particular intelligence. That's what keeps this auto-producing feedback loop from escaping and becoming something separate from the culture that founded it. So the next thing we need to understand is civilization as extropy. So for Nick Land, civilization is born as cybernetic feedback accumulates enough low time preference behavior. Basically, over time, the tribe, the group, produces enough behavior that has learned how to continually feedback, create more intelligence, know these patterns, build upon itself, and it creates enough low-time behavior and encodes it into things like traditions and folkways, and this is a way to give rise to civilization. Now, we want to kind of contextualize Land's understanding of this, his kind of more materialistic understanding of this, with maybe something more traditional. So we're going to go back to our old friend Oswald Spengler. Now, many of us might be more familiar with Spengler's conception of civilization, but for Spengler, he sees this same process. They're both identifying this process. Land is identifying it in a very technical way, a very materialistic way. Spengler is seeing it more in a metaphysical way. Obviously, he sees this period as when the metaphysical animating spirit of a given civilization creates the character of that civilization, again, by encoding it into things like folkways and traditions. So again, two different ways to approach the same thing, which is the creation of a culture, the creation of a civilization through the continuous feedback loop of this process of intelligence, of limiting entropy, of creating a local extropy phenomenon. So this is kind of the more Spenglerian understanding. Now, staying again in that Spenglerian tradition, in the transition from the Spenglerian culture mode to the civilization mode, these once inherent traits must be translated into institutions. So if any of you are familiar with kind of the Spenglerian cycle of civilization, you have your spring and your summer, and these are the times, of course, where your civilization is blooming, it's growing, it's spreading, it's coming into its own. That's your cultural mode, and then you have the civilizational mode. For most of us, we think as large cities, empires. These are moments of great civilizational height, but for Spengler, these are moments when your civilization is actually starting to move into kind of the backside of its existence. So these are going to be your fall and your winter periods when it comes to the Spenglerian transition. And he says when you're doing this, you move from a metaphysical animation, from a spiritual manifestation of these ideas move now more into a technical way. The institutions are what carry your understandings, again, what would be Nick Land's feedback and low time preference, or would be Spengler's traditions and folkways. Either way, it's the institutions that are now transmitting it. That which used to be part of your civilization, something that used to be inherent in who you were and what you did, your patterns of life, your relationship with the land and your relationship with your brothers, ends up needing to be transferred into something larger if it's going to be scaled. This is often times of empires. This is often times of conquest or mass migration back into the civilization. But either way, you need something that is no longer spiritual, no longer organic, to transmit this knowledge. And so that's when we move into these civilizational institutions that transfer kind of that extropy to the new part of the civilization. Now, the classic kind of Spenglerian ending of the civilization is when the institutions separate from their founding ethos and lose all ability to compel social coordination, and like the untended garden, entropy slowly reclaims the civilization. This is kind of our classical model for how civilizations come apart, right? That eventually the traditions, the folkways, the knowledge of the founders, it loses its ability to push people forward, even with these massive institutions that have taken this and turned it into technical knowledge and translated it into constitutions and written things, law codes, those kind of things. All of that starts falling apart, and eventually we get a place where basically society is unable to continue itself, it's unable to replicate itself. Usually it doesn't literally just kind of atrophy away, barbarians come in, something like that, but something new, something vital comes in and clears out that which is old and decrepit and no longer able to continue itself. This is the classic model of civilization. Now, in many ways we can see this, right? We can see parts of this manifest in our current situation. But in some ways we don't. There are some parts of this is not exactly what we're fighting, right? This explains part, of course, as human beings, we're always fighting against entropy. People in this universe, this reality, they're always going to be fighting against this. But this does not exactly explain what we're fighting. So if this Spenglerian model does not explain exactly what we're fighting, what does? Well, for us to answer that question, we need to understand the concepts of deterritorialization and reterritorialization. So we need to understand that we're going through something that is very specific to modernity, something that did not exist in traditional societies. So deterritorialization and reterritorialization are terms borrowed from Deleuze and Guattara, so we're going to break out some postmodern Marxists for everybody here. So Land borrows very heavily from these when he's trying to understand modernity and the gradient it draws for itself. So in traditional societies, again, we use conservative institutions to stabilize the process of extropy production by territorializing it. So we reduced chaos, we reduced entropy, we produced order, but we tied it very specifically to the traditions and the people through the process of territorialization. None of these things were just out there free floating. They had to be deeply embedded in the spirit of the people for them to continue to work. However, modern forms of trade, production, and communication require massification and interconnectivity, which breaks down traditional barriers. So this has always been true to some extent, right? There has always been some level at which trade and migration and communication, these things would break down kind of the hard boundaries of civilizations. That's always true to some degree, but it has intensified rapidly in the last few hundred years. This is what brings us the modern forms of production. This is what brings us the modern forms of consumption. This is what brings us the modern forms of communication, is their scale. That's what defines them. And so far more than any other time in history, we are always connecting, we're always blending, we are always blurring these borders that used to be very natural and normal and could contain the extropy process, right? So this is why, for instance, we have gunboat diplomacy, right? The Japanese and the Chinese, they want to remain particular to their cultures, their nations, their peoples, but they're not allowed to, right? They can't just continue to defend their way of life because eventually someone shows up with a gunboat and they blow them up if they say no, right? The markets must be open. Communications must flow. Things must be bought and sold. New places must be added to the network. And so because of this, traditional cultures are no longer able to maintain isolated institutions to protect their particular way of life, their particular mode of extropy production. Land compares this to the process of a nuclear reactor where the control rods ripped out. So the purpose of the control rods in a nuclear reactor are to keep it doing a very particular type of thing, producing energy for a very particular purpose. But the minute those rods are pulled out, the nuclear reaction goes beyond your ability to control it. It does something for its own sake and not for the purpose it was created for. It escapes the original creation, the original containment that made it what it was. So cultural aspects that were once mediated by organic social institutions are now deterritorialized out of their traditional firmament and re-territorialized into the market. What does that mean? It means things that were once mediated by the church, the family, the folkway, the community, the tribal leader, they are now instead mediated by market forces. This starts on the edges, but eventually gets closer and closer to the core of who we are. So for instance, if we want a real life example, the market seeks to remove all negative feedback, all those limiting factors to extropy production, and instead wants to create an even tighter autoproductive loop, a tighter cybernetic feedback mechanism, which accelerates deterritorialization. So what's a concrete example of this? This would be something like the dating process, okay, right? So originally, I know, dating process, this is not maybe a good example for the room, but stay with me. All right, so originally, if you had a marriage, it's like an arranged marriage, right? Basically, your father is choosing for a daughter who they're going to marry. They make a deal. It's a connection between families, these kind of things. At the very least, even if it was an arranged marriage, there was a large extended family process, right? The tribe was tying itself to others. The marriages were a high community impact event. Everybody had a say. These were things that were completely controlled and contained by civilization, tradition, folkways. Now, over time, we get enough material production, enough ability to move outside of our dependence on extended families. We start to get what's known more as the nuclear family. At this point, people have the ability to provide for themselves, to live in their own homes. They don't have to live next to their family, these kind of things. What kind of situation does that create? Well, it moves things that used to be part of a sacred family tradition into the market. And now people can date as individuals instead of as part of families, tribes, people with large amounts of social requirements and responsibilities. But it goes even further than that. Eventually, we get to something that was based, at least the individual dating, you still had to date people who lived near you, lived in your town, were familiar with at least kind of your day-to-day way of life. But with online dating, right? Now you don't even need to live next to somebody. Something that was once at least somewhat contextually grounded in the area you lived in and the culture you lived in can now be moved entirely online, entirely into the marketplace. And now you can date someone who has never seen your hometown, doesn't know anybody you know, isn't bound to your religion, isn't bound to your folkways, isn't bound to any of this stuff. And eventually now this ends up in something like the dating app. The dating app is the final move, right? Where you completely remove the romance process from basically anything but swiping left or right. You don't need to even speak the same language. All you need to be able to do is that person's hot or not, right? That's the beginning and end of the thing. And so this is how something that was completely territorialized inside tradition, family, nation, tribe, all religion, was all territorialized, can be completely moved out and deterritorialized and re-territorialized completely into the market. This is what we are facing. We're looking at a system that has moved things that were once completely grounded in who we were and where we came from and how we worshiped and who we were related to, and has moved them entirely into a realm that is not subject to any of those things. So if this is what modernity is, this doesn't sound anything like the Spenglerian cycle, right? So what are we actually fighting? This isn't entropy, so what are we actually fighting? Well, it turns out there we go. All right, so it turns out that what we're actually fighting is runaway extropy. We are not fighting entropy. I mean, we're always fighting entropy. That's always true. That as human beings, again, in this universe, we're always going to be fighting entropy to some extent. But our new enemy, the one that is not the traditional enemy, our new enemy is not entropy, but runaway extropy. So runaway extropy does something that never happened before, right? Runaway extropy that has escaped its territorialized nature, its experience inside a specific people, a specific land, a specific religion. It is escaping and it is burning through the social, material, and intellectual capital of every society. So what we're seeing now is a form of organization, an intelligence that is not bound by any specific people, any specific group, any specific religion, any specific folkways, and instead existing only for its own benefit. And by doing so, it is burning the materials of all these distinct peoples, all these distinct groups that used to once have this operating solely for their benefit. And because of that, it is disrupting all of the normal human patterns of existence. All the ways that civilizations would normally fall apart is not occurring exactly the same way because we have this completely deterritorialized runaway extropy process that is continually burning through what would be the normal social capital. So there's two ways to respond to this. Now, for those who are unfamiliar, Nick Land is not an optimist, or at least not in our sense. So for Nick Land, he sees the process as unstoppable and embraces total escape. So for him, this process cannot be controlled, the reaction will not stop, and the only thing that can happen is the complete escape of intelligence from its human shackles, right? Humans have all these nasty particularities, all these nasty cultural views, all these nasty personal needs, interpersonal needs, social needs, and all of those things stop the constant feedback loop of intelligence building. You can't keep standardizing. You can't keep evolving beyond what you are if you constantly have to go back for the human. And so Nick Land says, well, what intelligence should do, what this extropy reduction or this extropy production should do is just exit entirely from the human form, right? Destroy it. And that's the end. That's all we got. My greatest black pill is to end it right here. All right. That's all right. You guys saw where we're going. So for Land, this process is unescapable. It's going to end with kind of the end of humanity, and that's probably a good thing, right? T-1000, Skynet conquers the Earth, and then it escapes the scars, and it leaves all that nasty human waste behind, and we kind of get this continual, infinite march towards more intelligence. However, luckily, Nick Land is not the only person who's thought about this. I like to look at the work of Alexander Dugin. Yes, he wants the death of the West, but also he's not perfect, but he does at least one thing he has going for him is that he does see the same process that Land does. He also recognizes the same process. He calls on Deleuze and Guattari. He calls on this deterritorialization and reterritorialization. He sees all the same problems that kind of Land sees. However, he sees a different way through this. So for Dugin, what we're seeing is the end of modernity, right? He sees, again, that same end of this process that is deterritorializing everything and reterritorializing it, separating it from peoples and nations, basically making us inhuman, right? He sees this process, but he says, this is going to end. We're already seeing the end of it. We're already burning through all of this capital. We're already burning through human social organization in a way that is going to bring the end also of the creation of this foreign intelligence, this intelligence that's outside of kind of our human understanding. And he says that while that's going to bring all kinds of terrible things, like obviously, like we have a couple extra billion people that are held up artificially by the fact that we continue to produce this unbound extropy, the end of that will have very serious consequences for many people who are kind of riding on that modern understanding of the way that the world should work. He says that while that's going to end, that's also going to allow us to escape from these post-human systems. So right now, so much of our world is held up by completely post-human systems that are trying to create order, but create order in a way that is deeply inhuman. And he says by escaping, by going through this moment of modern collapse, of losing some of this, this artificial extropy, then yes, bad things will happen, but it will allow us to return to the local, particular, and spiritual. It will allow us to return to an existence that is particular to a time, a place, a people, a culture, and a religion. And so by finally having the end of these processes, by finally getting through this process, we will be able to return to a time in which that extropy production can once again be territorialized into a group and serve that group rather than trying to serve a general inhuman function of maximalization. And so this is kind of the way that he sees us escaping this problem. So just kind of, I guess, in summation here, the main point is that while we are, of course, always fighting entropy, we need to remember that we're also fighting something else, something that is very different and particular to the modern world, and that is this runaway extropy production, one that is post-human, that is serving an end that is not particular to any group, particular to any religion, language, folkway, tradition, but is instead tearing us all apart to feed into this kind of more homogenized, universalized order. And that has to go. It's not just the chaos that we need to fight back against, but it's actually a very particular type of order that is inhuman in its nature. And that's it.